Hello and welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. My name is Max Perry, and I'm an independent journalist and writer. My work is currently syndicated in Covert Action magazine, and we also have a guest here who's another writer at CAM. But before I introduce him, let me introduce my co-host and colleague, Shayna Batterson. Hi, Shayna.
Hi, everybody.
Shayna is better known as the Red Snail. Shayna is also a terrific writer, and everyone should check out her work on Substack as well. She goes by the Red Snail. Um, and also joining us, we have a special guest today to welcome, and his name is Garrett Ramirez. Garrett is also a writer, and his Substack is called The Social Populist. Everybody should check that out as well. Hi, Garrett. How are you doing today?
Hey, thank you for having me.
Great. Yeah. And so welcome. Garrett's writing attracted both of our attention. And so we thought we would have him on as our first guest to discuss some interesting topics he's covered because they overlap with some of our own. Garrett, in addition to being a writer, is also personally a former New York City teacher's assistant, uh, and or is a member of a group called Teachers for Choice, which is a medical freedom activist group comprised of teachers who were against the COVID or medical mandates. And so we'd also like to talk to him about that as well, his activism work. Um, but before we get into that, Shayna and I both have questions pertaining to his writing. And the initial thing that attracted us to his writing was he's a fellow writer at CAM, or he contributed an article to CAM, which I also write for. And he wrote a great article that everybody should read. We'll put a link in the about section of this episode. He wrote a great article called "Who is Anthony Sutton?" And for anybody watching and listening that doesn't know, Anthony Sutton is a best-selling author and a paleoconservative British American academic. And he wrote a number of books, um, but his most well-known work is a book called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. And that book, I think, really is widely cited and helped popularize this theory that you will frequently encounter in not just right wing, but populist circles in general, that the Russian Revolution, specifically the October Revolution, um, was financed by Wall Street bankers or Western financiers. Um, and I've written about that subject myself. We'll also put a link to my article, which is called "The Russian Revolution: Separating Truth from Myth." And my article, I address some of the more general claims that Sutton and others make about that allegation about the Russian Revolution. But Garrett's article goes into a lot more detail, especially in regard to the man himself. I didn't really do admittedly too much research about him and his background. I mostly just focused on the main claims. And actually, I really think our two articles really complement each other well because there's a little bit of overlap, but we mostly go after different assertions that are made. Um, and so, reading your article right off the bat, you state a really great quote. I want to read this. It says, "If you've ever heard the claim that one secret force controls both large-scale capitalism and large-scale communism all over the world, but that conspiratorial force is not the Jews, that too is the work of Anthony Sutton." And that line really jumped out at me because I think that, at least for myself, reading his work and other similar, uh, you know, writers in that mold, I guess my question for you is, do you think that there are any I mean, it's sort of hard to discuss this in light of like the Semitic hysteria happening now in regard to Israel and Gaza. But my question is, do you think that there are any sort of anti-Semitic tropes or implications in Sutton's work, or that he's using euphemisms or bywords when he talks about bankers being behind the Bolsheviks? I know that Sutton publicly denounced anti-Semitism, but do you think that this kind of like right-wing literature is sort of repackaging maybe what earlier texts like, Protocols of the Elders of Zion did? Do you think that there's any like implicit anti-Semitism there?
Yeah, there's definitely a connection. I don't want to, directly conflate the two and like oversimplify it and say he says that everyone who buys into this is an anti-Semite, or maybe at this point, even the majority of people who believe in it are probably not anti-Semites. But there's definitely a connection, whether people are aware of it or not. Um, the I mean, in some ways, it goes beyond uh, anti-Semitism. The history of conspiracy theories, and particularly the kind of conspiracy theories that Anthony Sutton promoted, um, they have a long history. And in some ways, it goes back to the French Revolution and the American Revolution in some ways. And so I would say that the overall thread is one of counter-revolution, rather than necessarily anti-Semitism. I think the thread is kind of the promotion of cynicism about legitimate revolution, and that the groups that you know implement successful revolutions are somehow conspiratorial and not legitimate. So the original like popularization of Illuminati conspiracy theories were mostly around the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, and they were promoted by aristocrats, by French aristocrats who'd been overthrown and their allies. Um, and there's a lot of like as I said about the emphasis of like elite secret societies in the French Revolution rather than it being a popular uprising of the masses. Um, in real life, there was elements of both, and actually that's an acknowledged thing in a lot of scholarship. There was a mainstream scholar in the mid 20th century named Crane Brinton, who wrote like an analysis of revolution. He was a very big historian in the 60s during the Kennedy administration. He was actually had a PBS series talking about revolutions, and what a nuanced view of revolution should be in light of all the revolutions that were taking place in the mid 20th century in the third world. But people who were counter-revolutionary in the late 1700s really like to promote this idea that the revolutions weren't legitimate and they came from these elite secret societies who are trying to sort of overthrow the good rulers for their own purposes. Now, of course, and again, there's a grain of truth in this because, of course, naturally, if you're underground and you're opposing the establishment that's tyrannical and that like was absolute monarchy, there's some secrecy involved. But there's secrecy involved in the American Revolution as well with the Sons of Liberty, and conservatives consider that to be legitimate, which is something that Crane Brinton pointed out. And this actually came back, this actually mainly came to the US when there was a contest between like Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians, between like Federalists and sort of Democratic Republicans, because the Jeffersonians were sympathetic with the French Revolution, and the Federalists said, this French Revolution is wicked and satanic, and it comes from secret elites who, hate Christian society, and they tied Jefferson to the Illuminati. This is actually a part of American history that,
Is that because of Freemasonry and stuff like that?
yeah, yeah. And of course, there's a grain of truth that, most of the founding fathers were Freemasons and a lot of the French revolutionaries too. And there was an element of secrecy around that. But of course, it was done because, it was the only way to evade the oppression of these monarchical forces. Yeah, there was a legitimate Freemason connection, and even a legitimate Illuminati connection, because in his private letters, Jefferson said that I'm not in the Illuminati, but from what I've heard, I sympathize with them because they're a progressive force, the real life historical Illuminati from the late 1700s, who engaged in secrecy partly because they were also underneath like an absolute Catholic theocracy in Bavaria. Now, and so there are ways where eventually this evolves into an explicitly anti-Semitic counter-revolutionary legend. In the early 20th century, promoted by the Tsar, the Russian Tsar, particularly after the 1905 Russian Revolution. Although an interesting interlude in this, of course, is that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is plagiarized from a tract that's written by a socialist, a French socialist. I'm forgetting his name, Maurice Joly, I think it was, who, he actually participated in the Paris Commune, and he wrote this kind of quasi-fictional, quasi-theoretical piece, and it was called something like Dialogue of Machiavelli and Montesquieu in Hell, right? And it was a satire on Napoleon III and kind of like the conspiratorial aspects of Bonapartism, where Bonaparte, as Karl Marx and many others observed at the time, kind of co-opted the left of his time, co-opted the working class movements, so that he was kind of running within France specifically. He was kind of running both the left and the right, right? So this idea that the left and the right, all of it is being run by the same forces, is kind of based on a specific analysis that a socialist gave about France under Napoleon III. And then this was plagiarized by the Tsar and his allies to impugn the Russian revolutionaries. So to a large extent, that's where it comes from. And then it's picked up and popularized in the US by the John Birch Society. And the John Birch Society are a complex phenomenon. Partly because, well, the guy who sort of like wove this into John Birch Society lore was an anti-Semite. He was a guy named Revelo P. Oliver, and he was like the intellectual heavyweight of the Birch Society. And he was a classics professor at the University of Illinois. And so he promoted this idea that, yeah, there's like a Moscow Wall Street nexus, and that the communist infiltration, of the sort of Joe McCarthy type perspective was so deep that and that it worked, but it was so elaborate, and it kind of worked both ways. It was just this one two-headed monster, although it was ultimately anti-communist because the Birch Society is an anti-communist organization. But Oliver himself was kind of like adopting this from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, but was initially cagey about it. But eventually he did come out as like an open anti-Semite and even anti-Christian, kind of like a neo-pagan, kind of neo-Nazi figure. And he was then ousted from the John Birch Society. Now, the head of the John Birch Society himself at the time, Robert Welch, he was the main founder. He was not an anti-Semite, at least, consciously or overtly. And so, he ousted Oliver. And he started like developing sort of a non-anti-Semitic version, though, of what Oliver was promoting, which is, as I said, there was this Wall Street, Moscow communist conspiracy, the secret opposition. And he started promoting that in the late 60s. like his version of it, sort of like sanitized, purged of the anti-Semitism. And so then Anthony Sutton comes in the early 70s very conveniently in the sort of right populist scene, claiming to have uh, academic citations for what Welch was already starting to promote in the late 60s. Um, I've probably mentioned some things uh, that aren't in depth in the article, but if you want a bit in depth about this, just in terms of the Birch Society, you should look at a book by a historian named Frederick Mintz called "The Liberty Lobby and the American Right," where he goes into the history of the Birch Society and its thinking quite deep and in a way that's quite fair, too, by the way, because there is a more famous scholar named Chip Berlay who writes a lot about the Birch Society and populism, whose work I don't necessarily endorse because he kind of has this anti-fascist theory that like all populism in America is inherently fascist, which I don't agree with. His work is kind of a sort of more biased version of what Frederick Mintz wrote about the Birch Society and populism in his Liberty Lobby book. But yeah, that's in a lot of ways where Anthony Sutton comes from. And he was an academic, but at the time that he wrote, his bestsellers and his populist and his hyper-conspiratorial stuff, he had left the academy and, well, he said that he had left the Hoover Institution, but it really isn't clear how and where he left it, which is something I noticed and wrote about in the article, where he actually testified in Congress as a friendly witness that he had been blacklisted from the Hoover Institution, which is associated with associated with Stanford University, although it's not 100% like academic in the sense that it's a think tank. So it has a known right-wing and actually neoconservative bias. But he claimed to have been blacklisted from there for, exposing this sort of hidden collusion between the US and Soviet governments. But his story doesn't really check out because he admitted that he was continuing to receive grants and had office space with
He
them.
was palling around with was it Richard Pipes or one of the big PNAC people, right?
Well, he in the 80s he said favorable things about Richard Pearl,
Or Richard
and
Pearl, I'm
but no,
sorry.
but oh yeah, also Richard Pipes. Richard Pipes endorsed Sutton's work, um, which as I said, it's a little bit odd because Sutton claimed that he was beyond the Cold War, but Richard Pipes is like the ultimate Cold Warrior, and he's also the ultimate elitist and globalist. Like Richard Pipes, is a diehard anti-communist historian who is involved in the Council for Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, like all of these elite capitalist globalist organizations, corporate globalist organizations that Sutton claimed to be, he was totally opposed to.
Um, I'm going to add, I think it's interesting that you brought up Freemasonry because I know Sutton wrote about the Illuminati and seemed to hate all these secret organizations, but he had one thing in common with the Freemasons is that they in Europe, the Freemasons were determined to fight back communism. So
Yeah, yeah. In the 20th century, yeah. I mean, the thing about these secret societies is that, the right populists would don't conceive of this way at all. They kind of the ones they complain about kind of represent the bourgeoisie, in my view, and I think they can, best be explained by sort of the Marxist view of the bourgeoisie, which is that they were like progressive and revolutionary in the 1700s and to some degree in the 19th century, but they're, counter-revolutionary today. And that would describe the Freemasons, let's say. The Freemasons have connections to the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But today, they're opponents of revolution because now they're the establishment.
I wanted to ask because that was a good history of sort of conspiracy theories. So do you think that its rise again today, do you think it is organic, or do you think it's promoted in the media? Because I definitely feel like it's helpful to the ruling class to promote these sorts of things.
Yeah, very much so. I think there's a reason why you know why right populism gets a little bit more traction than left populism. You know, why the establishment has some kind of room for a Donald Trump, but it didn't seem to have any room for a Bernie Sanders or a Jeremy Corbyn. It's just part of that same, I think, um, dynamic. Um, yeah, I mean, as I said in the article, when the system is breaking down, even conservatives aren't going to be loyal to the establishment anymore. The best you can do to misdirect the revolutionary energy is to promote cynicism about revolution and think that like the most revolutionary forces are actually frauds.
I wanted to ask you about Sutton in regard to your own activism, sort of in the sense that, I mean, during COVID, I don't know about you, but I personally witnessed like a huge trend on social media um, by people on the left and the right at large, sharing quotes from people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And, for people who don't know, he was a very prominent anti-Soviet dissident. Um, and people were sharing quotes from him talking about, you know, life under the USSR and oppression under communism, um, that seemed to be likening the lockdowns and mandates and COVID measures that people disagreed with, even though, you know, these were being obviously imposed by American or Western governments. Um, and in the beginning of your article, I noticed that you talk about the popularity of Sutton's work in what you call the American populist movement. And since I know you yourself were involved with activism in regard to the mandates, did you see a resurgence in popularity in his work in COVID circles? Because actually, the article that I wrote on the Russian Revolution, debunking Sutton's assertions, I wrote it because I had a back and forth exchange on social media with Mark Crispin Miller. I don't know if you know who that is, but
Yes, yes.
yeah, and he's a guy I really respect. That I really, I signed the thing when he was, you know, they were threatening to fire him or whatever, at NYU, and I signed the thing supporting him. I like him and respect him. But we got into this exchange about, and he was basically repeating a lot of the talking points about the Russian Revolution. And so I guess I just wanted to ask you if you encountered like a lot of this kind of stuff while you were doing your activism, just
Yeah,
being
that
on the I'm assuming you're a Marxist, just being a Marxist yourself, moving in those political circles.
Yeah, yeah. And that was really one of the main inspirations for the article is that people, not all like right populists in the US cite Sutton, but a lot of the times, if they're not anti-Semitic and they don't blame it on the Jews, but they blame it on the communists, then usually the framework that they're working from is the Sutton framework. Um, and it's a tricky thing because yeah, Mark Crispin Miller and then a lot of libertarians are some of the best journalists and activists um, against medical tyranny, against medical mandates, what I call forced human experimentation, of the COVID era. They're very good on that, and libertarians are good on a lot of other things, like anti-Zionism, better than many liberals. So they've definitely been allies. And so I kind of wanted to like, pick apart the threads of, where they're right and where they're wrong. And generally they tend to be right in analyzing the present, but not so good in analyzing the past and the future. And the left, and it goes through left populism as well and left-wing anarchism. Um, but there's this whole like sort of anti-communist paradigm that works on the left as well, that is kind of like embedded in our culture through like George Orwell, the kind
And
of thesis of.
Bakunin did a lot of, he long before even the Protocols of Elders of Zion, I know Bakunin was promoting anti-Semitic things about Marx.
Yes.
They're pretty well documented.
Yeah.
Um, I like if you could talk a bit of what you wrote about in your article about regards the relationship of the bankers to Lenin and the other revolutionaries, because I found when I found out that Sutton was saying that, I found that quite absurd because I had just read this book by Lenin where he systematically lays out how much power the banks have. And to me, I was like, well, why would the bankers fund someone who literally wrote a book about how bad the bankers are? So
Why did they need to why did Stalin need to be the most prolific bank robber in Russia if they were getting funding from?
Yeah. Well, it's funny, again, the sort of anti-communist paradigm in the US is to the level where like a lot of people, intellectuals and even lay people, it's kind of, it's all right to like study Mein Kampf for historical purposes, but people are just like generally discouraged from, reading the actual communist classics and, what communists thought. So they don't actually know that Lenin, uh, you know, did target finance capital as a particular evil that was sort of enslaving the Russian people. And one of his grievances against the Tsar was, letting foreign bankers kind of like buy up the country and getting into like hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. Um, but that's I guess part of the legacy of the Red Scare. People are afraid to read this stuff, and it's not well represented even in the mainstream scholarship, the liberal scholarship.
Yeah, you write about the role of the American Red Cross mission to Russia, that Sutton, I guess, identified as a piece of evidence showing this supposed conspiracy between Wall Street financiers and the Bolsheviks. And in your article, it shows that a closer look at the facts actually proves the opposite. And just as like a historian, I mean, he really engaged, it seems like, in almost deliberate deception. I mean, for example, you show that he actually plagiarized from, of all places, or at least plucked information from an article in Pravda, which was, of course, the Bolsheviks' newspaper. And in that article, the Bolsheviks were accusing the provisional government, which is the government that took power. I mean, people forget that before the Bolsheviks took power, there was a provisional government in power from February 1917 to October. And they accused the provisional government of being supported by Wall Street, which to some extent has some level of truth to it. And he took that information and used it to support his claim that it was the Bolsheviks that were supported by Wall Street, which is really kind of a shocking level of dishonesty and propaganda. Do I have that right? Is that what you're arguing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it couldn't have been an accident. He very deliberately made an effort to twist something that was an accusation by the Bolsheviks against the provisional government, the Kerensky government, uh, and try to make that sound like that was an accusation coming from anti-Bolsheviks against the Bolsheviks. And yes, it was a very deliberate deception. It capitalizes on the fact that that provisional government, that basically liberal government that was supported by the U.S. and Britain,
And supported continuing the war too, right?
right, supported continuing the war. But they were called the Socialist Revolutionaries. So Sutton capitalizes on that, that confusion. Although it kind of like shows up how popular socialism was generally in Russia. That even the relatively conservative, forces of the revolution, even the right wing of the revolution, identified as socialists. But he tries to make it sound like, yeah, these socialist revolutionaries, that those are the Bolsheviks, when of course that's the actual right wing of the revolution that the Bolsheviks overthrew. And they were supported by Wall Street through the Red Cross mission, because Wall Street and the US elite wanted to keep them fighting the Germans in World War II, whereas the Bolsheviks wanted to pull out of the war. They were the anti-war party in Russia, and that's why they ultimately became the most popular party in Russia and succeeded in overthrowing the socialist revolutionaries, as they were called.
Yeah, I have I just wanted to, because most of our articles, 2 articles, discuss different claims, but the one area of overlap was the weird circumstances around Trotsky's release from Canada in April. And I myself always found it suspicious as to why an allied country would let him go. I mean, because he was a revolutionary and presumably he would go back to Russia and help Russia withdraw from the war. And, I know that both Lenin and Trotsky, I think Lenin was in Switzerland at the time, but there was a lot of accusations by the Mensheviks and others that they were puppets of the Germans. And I always thought that the reason that he was released was because if you look at his actions during the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, it was actually advantageous to the Allies because he was one of the few Russian leaders, and he was foreign minister during those negotiations, that wanted to. I mean, he claimed not to want to continue the war, but he advocated neither war nor peace, which kind of like was nonsensical and really disrupted the negotiations. And he later ended up getting they circumvented. He was trying to insert his own
Foreign policy.
policies. Yeah. Do I have that right? Are you? Well, specifically that your article, I didn't know this, but it shows that the Kerensky-led provisional government, their foreign minister, was who arranged for his return to Russia from Canada. Do I have that right?
Yes, their foreign minister, Pavel Miliukov, said up front in his memoirs that he got Trotsky released from the British, who had detained him for a month in Canada, as Trotsky was on his way back to Russia. Yeah, it can be hard these days to get the truth on that, because I've ever even seen academic papers that misrepresented that, or sort of did the Sutton kind of cagey thing where they say, well, it's very mysterious. It's very mysterious why the British let Trotsky out, and it's very suspicious. But really, any academic, including Sutton, knows the primary sources, and as I said, Sutton must have known the primary sources. He worked at the Hoover Institution, which has the most thorough Russian archives in North America, and this wasn't even hard to find. That the Russian foreign minister said that the British, who he was allies with because they were fighting World War I together, said, yes, please let Trotsky into the country. There's a general amnesty now that we've overthrown the Tsar. And then Miliukov also said, we thought possibly, we could use him against Lenin because they were rivals at the time, because Trotsky, only joined the Bolsheviks like 6 months before the revolution, and him and Lenin were bitter rivals prior
I
to
thought it
that.
was only 1 month. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I thought he joined in September. I could be wrong about that though.
No, I think it was May, around May, I think.
Okay.
I think it was around May. Because I think he was a Bolshevik during the July days. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I know for years, I mean, he called himself like a non-factional, like he was not part of either faction, but it's clear like the way that he joined was kind of opportunistic, or maybe it was the fact that the Mensheviks or the provisional government voted to continue the war. But anyway, I know Shayna wanted to read an excerpt from your or a section from your article.
Yeah, I just wanted to read this part really quickly. You wrote, quote, Wall Street also had clear motivation to preserve a Russian government that would pay back the 1.7 billion in loans from Morgan associated banks in some form. But the financiers had no reason to expect such cooperation from Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who was among those Russian militants who had denounced foreign debt. Indeed, Lenin's last major book before the revolution was Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which observed that, quote, the country which exports capital skims the cream. The Bolshevik founder asserted that capitalism, which began its development with petty usury capital, is ending its development with gigantic usury capital. Economic historian Hassan Malik notes that finance capital and its destruction would become a central theme in Lenin's speeches and writings leading up to the revolution. Lenin's foremost fiscal action would be the repudiation of Tsarist debts after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which was the largest and longest running default in more than 800 years of financial history. Sutton does not mention any of these facts.
Yeah, yeah. The there's really, people should educate themselves on this stuff, because the Hassan Malik book, has been out for several years. It documents quite well what the actual relationship and position of the Bolsheviks was with Western finance capital. Um, and Yeah, finance capital is something that Lenin denounced a lot. There are people on the left, unfortunately, the American left, who themselves kind of almost rewrite this history. Again, that guy Chip Berlay, who tries to equate fascism with populism, says that, one of the markers of like fascism is to like uh, uh, focus on and denounce finance capital, ignoring the fact that Lenin was focused on criticizing and denouncing finance capital. The relationship between Lenin and fascism, and populism, is really that, like, the fascists kind of plagiarized Lenin, that they kind of co-opted, his critique of capitalism, like, for their own ends.
They
Not
were
that.
even saying that about Steve Bannon remember when Steve Bannon put out like that manifesto or whatever, like in 2016, like they were saying that Bannon is a Leninist or something like that. I mean, it was just absurd.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think, as you were saying about the writings of the socialists, which influenced the protocols of the elders of Zion, it seems like a lot of these sort of right-wing tropes and analysis is why come from the left or from Marxist analysis. They get somehow distorted and twisted around. It's actually something I'm writing an article about right now. So
Yeah, I mean, it's like really devious and unfortunately brilliantly effective psychological warfare that counter-revolutionaries have been doing for a very long time.
Yeah, God, we could talk about this one Sutton all day, but I did want to get to we did want to get to another article that you wrote on your blog or your Substack, The Social Populist, which everyone should check out. Terrific article about another great piece left-wing history, and that is about the Black Panthers. Specifically, in this article, you talk about some of the political divisions that existed within the Panthers, and actually some of which I had not considered before. So I thought it was a really good article. I know that, it's pretty well known that throughout the course of the history of the Panthers, there was a big division between, or a division developed between the Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver wings, which later actually split the party into East Coast and West Coast factions. And then when Cleaver went to jail, the Black Liberation Army split from that. But you address a different sort of division, and that was between Stokely Carmichael or at least an ideological division between Stokely Carmichael and the late Fred Hampton. And I thought this was a really interesting analysis that I wanted you to get into, because, well, first of all, Stokely Carmichael, who later became known as Kwame Ture, when he left the Panthers and went to Africa. I know in the early days that COINTELPRO documents famously showed that the FBI and Hoover specifically wanted to prevent the rise of what they called a Black Messiah, or sort of like a successor to not just Martin Luther King, but also
Malcolm X.
Malcolm X specifically. Sorry, that could unite the Black Liberation Movement. And it seems like at a certain point, Fred Hampton took the place of Stokely Carmichael, and I know that one of the things that caused Stokely Carmichael to leave the Black Panther Party, I could be wrong about this, but was because the tactics of Fred Hampton, who was the head of the Chicago branch, formed what was called the Rainbow Coalition, which of course is something that was later co-opted by,
Democrats.
Yeah, Democrats and Jesse Jackson, people like that. And that involved working with not just the Young Lords, who were a Puerto Rican street gang that became a militant group and activists, but also even a group representing poor whites called the Young Patriots, who were mostly white Southerners who moved to a poor area of Chicago called, I believe, Hillbilly Harlem. And their iconography, they used actually a Confederate flag. And so this decision was very controversial because Hampton put together these groups to find common ground based on class struggle. And famously, the Young Patriots even abandoned, their white supremacy and their racism. And I think even at one point, like the leader of the Young Patriots went to Africa when Eldridge Cleaver was there, and saw the poverty. And but either way, this was a totally breaking new ground in terms of abandoning identity politics versus class struggle. So I guess my question for you is, when do you think the focus shifted from Stokely Carmichael to Fred Hampton as far as the FBI's persecution of the Panther leadership?
Well, I can't say exactly, but as I said, I'm just going by the fact, the behavior of the FBI, let's say, that well, many Black leaders in that era were persecuted. I don't think anyone was like targeted as aggressively as Fred Hampton, to the point where they shot him in his bed after having an FBI agent drug him. Like they seem to have been more tightly focused on Fred Hampton than anyone else, except maybe Martin Luther King. Because, I believe that because he was trying to build a Black-white working class coalition, which is something that, MLK was more focused on than ever at the time. of his death. It's something that Malcolm X was probably moving towards at the time of his death, because he had taken less of an anti-white cultural nationalist position, and he was talking to the Socialist Workers' Party. So that seems to be the thread in terms of, what the FBI hates most. Stokely Carmichael apparently was persecuted with death threats, and supposedly a phony death threat from another faction of the Panthers that the FBI phoned in, that led him to flee the country in 1969. But ultimately, Stokely Carmichael was able to come back to the US. And just about every year, he went back and forth between the US and Africa, and did tours of college campuses regularly, I think starting in 1971, and for decades afterwards. So the FBI definitely seems to have played a role in suppressing the class struggle aspect of the Black Panthers, and promoting the more, narrow identity aspect of it, that left a more lasting role on the American left.
Um, can you talk, you mentioned in your article about how the Panthers have become woke washed today. Can you talk a bit about how you feel like they're today represented a lot differently than they actually were?
Yeah, that's another failing, or maybe a crime of modern academic scholarship that you wouldn't expect. But one of the major scholars of Fred Hampton and the Panthers is a guy named Jacoby Williams, a history professor. And in his book, he claimed that he made it sound like the Panthers were never supporters of Marxist-Leninism. And I think the sneaky way he framed it, when he said that both Huey Newton and Stokely Carmichael agreed that you know uh, communism and socialism was not the solution for Black Americans. Uh, I think what he's referring to is that later on in the 70s, Huey Newton stopped being a Marxist-Leninist. He kind of developed his own theory. But at the height of the Panthers' popularity, when they were a truly national organization in 68, 69, Huey Newton was right there with Fred Hampton in being a genuine Marxist-Leninist, and that was their line. And Stokely Carmichael was pushed out of the Panthers, not necessarily violently, COINTELPRO aside, but aggressively, because Stokely Carmichael would not commit to Marxist-Leninism.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I mean, I think that the term woke wash is totally accurate, because I mean, it's just so cringe nowadays, especially like just even seeing stuff like just like the popular you know tote bags with like the free breakfast program logo on it and stuff, and it's like they've just been reduced to this thing. Yes, of course they did the arm patrols and the the sickle cell anemia testing and the free breakfast program, but they were so much more than that, and their whole concept of dual power came really, I think, from the influence of Marxist-Leninism. And even Eldridge Cleaver, like when he fled and spent time in North Korea. And I think that you're onto something there as far as modern day, like woke liberal academics. I mean, I hate to even use that term, but it's really true as far as I mean, Cornel West always talks about the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King Jr. And I think it's definitely some of the same thing going on between with the Panthers. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
there's definitely
totally see that.
yeah, I mean, there's definitely an undermining of their class analysis. Um, Now, in some ways, it makes it easy, because Eldridge Cleaver himself much later, became an anti-communist. So it's
A Mormon,
relatively
right?
possibly he was definitely a Christian Republican.
Yeah, he had some
At the
weird
same time, he was still married to you know,
Kathleen. Yeah.
Kathleen Cleaver, oddly enough. I don't know what's going on there, but
Um, I wanted to ask you. You contrasted Well, actually, I guess let me go over to Shayna. She should ask you the next question.
Um, I was I think it's interesting how a lot of people today act like Black Lives Matter is sort of the following in the footsteps of the Panthers. And could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. I mean, I used to be, supportive and involved in Black Lives Matter, and it's partly why I wrote this article, just trying to figure out, what was it really all about? Did it really make any sense? Was it really revolutionary? And yeah, I decided it wasn't, but I still saw a lot of value in the Panthers, and so it's sort of trying to figure out, what is the difference between the Panthers at their peak in the late 60s when they were a national organization, a national phenomenon. The difference between them and Black Lives Matter, and not just Black Lives Matter, but the majority of what calls itself the Black left today. Um, as I said, and I think it does come down to um, sort of that there's more of a Stokely Carmichael influence, and identity politics, sort of race is the primary issue. Everything comes down to race, and this sideline or just erasure of the class issue, which is ultimately what the Panthers, when they were at their peak as a revolutionary organization, was what they were focused on, and focused on building alliances between the black and white working class.
Speaking of which, what I was going to ask you before I had a brain fart there and had to defer to Shayna. I don't know if this prompted the article you wrote at all as well, but there was a pretty big scandal a couple years ago, at least within the, you know, leftist circles, um, when, Jimmy Dore, who's a very popular figure, he's a comedian, he's got his big show on YouTube. I actually just saw him recently here in Baltimore live. And at this event that I went to, there was the widest range of people I've ever seen. I mean, there was MAGA people, there was left-wing people. It was, I mean, it was people of every ethnic background. Um, and a few years ago, he got into hot water because he um, had he had as a guest on his
The
show, not
Boogaloo
even in
Boy.
person, on yeah, Boogaloo Boy,
Yeah.
which is not even it's such a decentralized, not even like a real serious right-wing militia. I mean, and he was just relentlessly attacked as platforming um, Nazis or just this total hysteria, I thought. And I got into several exchanges with people, and one of the things I cited was um, the Rainbow Coalition, and specifically that Fred Hampton's. I mean, not to compare Jimmy Dore to Fred Hampton, but the willingness to. I mean, this is just a conversation on Zoom that Jimmy Dore had, let alone working with them directly in community projects, in addressing social inequality and the needs of poor whites, in solidarity with these other. I mean, because Chicago was having a really tough time economically, um, and these different groups, the Young Lords, the Young Patriots, the Panthers branch in Chicago, um, and what was the other group? United Against something. I can't remember. It was a coalition, and they um, they broke sort of the same. I mean, I think that this is one of the reasons that Hampton was targeted. I mean, apart from his charisma and his, the fact that he was so young, he was only 21, and he was. I mean, I last night, to brush up, I rewatched the 1971 documentary Murder of Fred Hampton, and towards the end, when he gives the speech, "I'm a revolutionary," it's absolutely shocking because there's a part in it where He says
White power for white people.
white power for white people,
Yeah.
black power for black people. If somebody were to say this now, can you imagine the sort of hysteria? And I guess I just wanted to see if your article was inspired at all about, based on, or what, even if not, what your thoughts were about the whole Jimmy Dore controversy. Because this is, I mean, people were acting like it was dangerous for him to even engage in a conversation. It's just the left today is just so afraid to get its hands dirty and even engage with people that have a different point of view, that this is the kind of reaction you get just from having a conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Jimmy Dore was part of the direct, inspiration for the article, the kind of testy interview he had with Cornel West, where Cornel West was sort of painting a one-dimensional view of the MAGA movement as being a fascist white supremacist movement. And Jimmy Dore was pushing back on that. And Jimmy Dore is a huge admirer of Fred Hampton, and said that that was one of his inspirations. This group that's associated with Dore, this black group, and black online program, Revolutionary Blackout Network, they started out being called the Fred Hampton leftists. They unfortunately had to lose that name because the Hampton family objected to it. So they don't call themselves the Fred Hampton leftists anymore. But yeah, that's something that Dore was and his crew and his associates were trying to revive, and very much needs to be revived. Yeah, I personally, from what I've read, I think if Fred Hampton were alive, he would give Dore his blessing. Uh, that was the centerpiece of his organizing when he died, when he was killed, when he was murdered by the state, by the FBI, to bring the white working class into a revolutionary movement, even if they were superficially racist.
I,
Even if they waved the Confederate flag, if they literally waved the Confederate flag, that was
And
not
this
a deal
Boogaloo
breaker.
boy was not even doing anything like
No,
that.
he
There's
wasn't.
nothing. There was not. He didn't say anything racist. There was no. I mean, yeah, you could. I mean, are there people within those circles that hold racist views? I'm sure, but this particular one, I mean, it's totally decentralized. This guy in the interview never espoused any of those kind of views, but people were in such hysterics that
Yeah,
I
and
think
something
it's
I
kind of
quote
emblematic of the problems today.
Yeah, and something I quote in the article is that Bob Lee, who was Fred Hampton's lieutenant, his on-the-ground organizer in Chicago, who first connected with the Young Patriots, with the White Southernist organization. Um, there was controversy among the Black Panthers, among uh, there's controversy among the Black Panthers when they first started to work with the Young Patriots. And some of the Panthers who were Black nationalists, who said they didn't want to work with these racist or seemingly racist white people, they left the Chicago Panthers. And Fred Hampton and Bob Lee let them go because the first priority for them was to build this coalition with the white working class, because that's how much of a class first agenda it was.
I think it's interesting, especially today, in regards to when you were talking about counter-revolutionary tactics, because there's so much stuff about, you can't make these alliances, you don't, encouraging people not to make broad, like across political spectrum alliances. But I think a lot of times those alliances, if they have a shared class base, are important and people can always change their minds. And I'd like to.
Yeah, no, it's very important, and that's also something that comes from Lenin, because Lenin, in pre-revolutionary Russia, the Bolsheviks had a phase where they were in direct conflict with the Black Hundreds. The Black Hundreds
Yes.
were a pro-czarist, anti-Semitic
Yes.
militia. And there was a period when the Black Hundreds were like directly attacking, massacring Jews, um, and the Bolsheviks fought them. But there are also periods where there was less anti-Semitic activity going on in the right, where Lenin said to go and organize, go and talk to the Black Hundreds and try to bring them to our side, because many of them are workers. So and that's the classical, that's the classical communist line and the classical left populist line.
Yeah, I also that's a great example, and when I've used that example too about the Black Hundreds. That it's worth it to, especially in times like these where the Overton window is opening up, and capitalism is in a period of crisis. You're going to see workers going towards you know different perspectives outside the mainstream, and if anything, like those people are more recruitable now than I think, like certainly mainstream liberals. I mean, I'm not necessarily a proponent of like MAGA communism or whatever. I mean, that's a whole other discussion. But I do think that there's like, they're onto something there as far as like the potential of people who are questioning, mainstream narratives about things, and are looking for an answer to the social totality, um, or different explanations.
I think what the MAGA communists are doing is very important. And yeah, I don't think there's anyone else on the left who's doing that. And yeah, it's now they're called the American Communist Party. It's
Right.
broken off from the Communist Party USA. Um, and so yeah, uh, that's the kind of thing we need.
Definitely. I also wanted to, while we have time, I mentioned your activism and the group that you were part of. I know you were a New York City school educational assistant, and you were part of the steering committee for a group called Teachers for Choice, which on your bio on CAM you describe as a medical freedom activist group comprised of teachers and parents who are 100% against medical mandates, especially ones that may risk the loss of a job. And I understand you lost your own employment over this. So could you maybe talk about that, or uh, and then I know Shayna has some questions about that. Yeah, over the gene therapy mandates and all that.
Yeah, when COVID came down, there weren't many people on the left who wanted to organize against it, or maybe I should say any people, aside from a handful, like Christian Parenti, who has been very supportive of our work. But for the most part, the left was very sort of zombie-like, following the public health establishment in saying that COVID was a new plague, and all of the emergency measures were justified and had to be followed to the T. And if you were anti-science, that you were a eugenicist. I think it was more eugenicist to well, to give doctors absolute authority over everyone's body, and then eventually to force them to take, as you say, a gene therapy labeled as a vaccine. But yeah, this experimental mRNA technology that has been now proven to alter gene expression, contrary to what they told us. And most of it was a pack of lies. And Michael Caine, who is a New York City teacher who had worked with Robert F. Kennedy's organization in the past, started organizing in 2020, first to resist the testing, the mandated COVID testing and the school closures, and eventually the vaccine mandates, which were, of course, being discussed then, Operation Warp Speed. And then, the mandates came in 2021, and we resisted them as long as we can. We were initially suspended without pay in the fall of 2021 to try and pressure and sort of economically coerce anyone who was vaccine skeptical. And eventually, those of us who held out and didn't take the mRNA shot were fired in February 2022. And we have multiple lawsuits, and we've won some of the lawsuits in some courts, but the city, first under Mayor de Blasio, now under Mayor Eric Adams, continue to appeal the decisions that are in our favor. So there's no restitution. We're not allowed back to our jobs. Many of us have problem codes, which are codes that are usually put on people who were child molesters or otherwise felons, teachers who were felons.
Wow.
That is essentially a blacklist, which the federal government participates in. These problem codes, so-called, are a kind of federal blacklist that is held many teachers back from getting jobs in education since. So we're fighting all of that in the courts and in Albany, and the struggle continues for that. But the left, unfortunately, as I said, has not been helpful. And one thing, it's very unfortunate. But as I said, again, a lot of right populists and libertarians are correct in their analysis of present day communists, because most of the mainstream communist organizations in the US are totally behind this medical repression, and it's an ongoing dilemma, unfortunately.
Yeah, you can't really blame them for having those. It makes it doubly hard when they have those misconceptions about the past, when the imposters now are exhibiting all that.
Yeah, and you had our Marxist celebrities like Slavoj Žižek going around, basically promoting the Great Reset. So it's if you live in the eternal present, and if you only think about the U.S., then it's understandable why people are right populists. It's not understandable if you look at the big picture, if you look at the rest of the world, if you look at the past. And so that's why it's important to be aware of the influence of people like Anthony Sutton.
I think that the mandates were very interesting, especially because a lot of the Marxist theory has always talked about capitalism as the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And I think we could really see that with the mandates, because working class people were the ones most affected, because they couldn't afford to lose their job necessarily, and then would be coerced into getting it. Whereas if you were rich, I mean, I question whether these very rich people like Bill Gates even actually got the shot, but that's a whole nother topic. Did you notice working class people being penalized more during that time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, everything in our society, the shit rolls downhill, and working people suffer the most. But yeah, I mean, obviously, there's even a division between what's called the professional managerial class, and the more blue collar workers, that if you have a laptop job, you can keep doing your laptop work from home, but you can't do that. You can't do that if you have a physical working class job. And of course, all the businesses were shut down. Massive percentage of small businesses closed. and yeah, the economy was thrown into complete turmoil, massive recession, and then ultimately the greatest upward transfer of wealth in the country's history, or maybe the world's history, uh, in terms of the bailouts to the big businesses in the recession, with only a pittance really given to working people, in their COVID relief. And that was not, I don't think that was any kind of, working class socialism, socialism the way Marx or even Lenin would envision it. That was just uh, the state working, as you say, for the bourgeoisie, for the big capitalists to bail them out. And it's the same as with the 2008 bailout. Uh, there was some stimulus checks at the time in 2009 for working class people.
I didn't get one.
Well, yeah. for
At least I don't
for a
remember.
handful of people, and a handful of people benefited maybe from Obamacare, but for the most part, these were just bailouts. That this was the state acting to give out massive handouts to billionaires and corporations.
I wanted to ask you, since you were involved with activism, in regard to this issue, um, there were a lot of polls, and for totally understandable historical reasons, showing that among, the most vaccine hesitant or skeptical or whatever you want to call it, the overwhelming uh, demographics uh, skewing towards that uh, hesitancy were racial minorities, especially Black Americans and Hispanics. And given the US's history of medical experimentation and all kinds of, Tuskegee experiments and all the rest of it, I mean, one of the few organizations telling, Black Americans, encouraging them not to go along with the inoculation was the Nation of Islam, actually. But I guess I just wanted to ask, within your own uh, movement in terms of the education system, is your group mostly made, like, what the demographics are of the group, or whether you observe those same um, uh, demographic indicators as far as the who comprised those who were skeptical?
I think I mean, it lines up pretty well with the composition of the teaching staff of New York City. Um, and there's a there is a fired teacher who's a young Black woman who's campaigning for city council right now, uh, who we're supporting. She's running as a Republican, partly on a platform of, you know, resisting these medical mandates and not allowing these, states of emergency to come through again and destroy people's jobs and destroy their civil liberties and destroy the economy. Um, Her name is Athena Clark, by the way, if you want to check it out. And Teachers for Choice is a Substack, too, I should mention, by the way, if you want more information on the group. Um, so it's yeah, that's definitely something that we're aware of, and the irony of it that Black Lives Matter kind of peaked in the COVID period is something that I was very much aware of, and one of many things that's kind of exposed that movement is fraudulent and not really representing the interests of the Black working class.
Yeah, I just know that in my personal life, at my places of employment, I don't want to get into the details of it, but that's what the personally, everyone I know that lost their job was either Black or Hispanic, and it was
Mm.
the my own personal life, as far as what I observed, lined up with those statistics. And of course, with the measures, the people who suffered the most from those measures and the consequences were people of those backgrounds. So I just think that that's a relevant aspect that really was not talked about very much. And it's for the same reason that, like, for example, with the immunization itself, I know that there was a lot of reports, even in mainstream media, about how, women's uh, menstruation cycles were disrupted by the immunization and things like that. But, amongst various, these people that champion identity politics, my point is that those concerns were just dismissed, even though they're coming from these groups that they claim to, that's the priority of who we need to champion and address. It's just the hypocrisy during that time and now continues. It was so noticeable to me.
Yeah, I mean, the modern left is a mess, and it basically follows the lead of the Democratic Party, even when they claim to be going against the Democratic Party. Like, I feel like the Democratic Party and their corporate donors basically set the agenda, and Big Pharma are one of those donors to the Democratic Party. Um, and all the groups in the World Economic Forum, the corporations in the World Economic Forum, are I think donate even more money to the Democrats than to the Republicans, and they fund the left through their foundations, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and Soros. And so that's totally deformed the modern U.S. left, and they don't even stick, as you say, don't even stick to their own principles of identity. It's just it's just a mess.
Since you mentioned RFK, I'd be curious to know what you think of him, and especially the sort of turn he's taken today working in Trump's cabinet. I know recently he just came out promoting the measles vaccine a couple of weeks ago, I believe.
Well, yeah, I think he said that it was one of the options that parents had. I don't know if he full on recommended it. As I said, he said it was one of the options people had alongside vitamin A treatment. Uh, so I don't know what to say about the Trump administration exactly at this time, RFK included. Um, I we had a vote in Teachers for Choice on whether or not to endorse Trump. And I voted against because there's even medical freedom arguments against Trump, obviously, because he accepted the lockdowns and he, funded the so-called vaccine, the mRNA shots, and recommended them. But I was outvoted, and the group did endorse him after he brought RFK into the administration and onto the campaign. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's complicated, but I do like most of RFK's policies so far, just the direction that they're going. I mean, his reforms are still in progress. He's just getting the team together and purging out, the Fauci followers. Fauci's wife only left the National Institutes of Health last week, I believe. And she was the head of bioethics, so called. So basically, Anthony Fauci's watchdog all those years was his wife to see if he was being ethical. So we'll see what happens with the medical policy in the Trump administration.
Yeah, I just know that RFK Jr., he ran the Children's Health Defense website for many years and left it once he became, I don't know if he left when he started running for president or when he
Yeah,
yeah, and he's been taking a lot of flack from them already. They've been written a number of critical articles about him. So it does seem like there's some people who are followers of him that are disappointed so far, but I'm sure that there are just as many who are giving it time. I mean, I know it's like a new sheriff in town kind of thing. But I wanted to ask you, I guess, just based on your activism and your blog, I noticed is titled "The Social Populist." And coming from a left-wing background yourself, um, I guess I wanted to ask you about the meaning behind the name, which do you feel like socialists have become sort of vulgar anti-populists, or that has popula and then at the same time has populism become anti-communist, or am I reading too much into the significance of the name of your Substack, or is that sort of what you're getting at?
No, I mean, vulgar anti-populist about sums it up with the modern American left. And that's been coming around for some time. Thomas Friedman, who's like a mainstream liberal, actually wrote a book about it a few years ago called "The People Know," about how the Democratic Party was not just, not populist, but it was anti-populist. Um, and Yeah, like Elizabeth Warren, people like Elizabeth Warren would make some populist noises here and there and criticizing Wall Street, but it is kind of half-hearted. And I think Friedman even sort of called her out once that you know most most of the corruption with Wall Street is taking place in the Democratic Party. And as I said, they kind of set the agenda for the entire left right now. Um, so yeah, it's important. I think it's important to identify as a populist. I think that, contrary to what most of the country thinks, that Marxism or the populism is what distinguishes Marxism from other kinds of socialism. That he said it's the real movement of the people against the establishment, and it's centered on the working class majority. And that's what distinguished uh, Marx from most of the forms of socialism that came before him, which were top down. And I'm perfectly willing to now acknowledge that there are negative types of socialism, right? Or misguided forms of socialism. The forms that came before Marx, that he called utopian socialism, a lot of them were top down, where you had a guy like Robert Owen, who was like a multimillionaire who sort of, wanted to form these communes, but he would run them. And they were sort of they weren't centered in the labor movement. Whereas, Marx wanted a socialism that was from the bottom up and that was based on workers' councils, which is the Russian word for workers' councils is Soviet. So I think it's very important for the left to get back to populism. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think Charles Fourier was another utopian socialist that he really criticized, that had the same sort of uh, what you were describing as top down political philosophy, or utopian socialism.
Yeah,
And
and he even called out bourgeois socialism, which I think evolved into Fabian socialism, and this sort of John Stuart Mill, H.G. Wells strand of elitist socialism and British Labour Party. And the right populists are correct to oppose that and to say that is kind of globalist, sort of elitist and anti-democratic form of internationalism and socialism that all working people should oppose.
yeah, this that's great. Yeah. Yeah, this has been a great discussion. I feel like we could go on and on and on. We probably could have had an individual episode about each one of these. I know we covered some pretty big topics. Um, but yeah, this was a great discussion, and we're going to post links to the Social Populist, your article on the Panthers, and do you have anything else? Your CAM article as well. But do you have anything else that you wanted to plug as far as like work you're doing now, or um,
Um, Yeah, I have an article that coming up. It's called it's called the Oligarchic Roots of DEI, which sort
Hmm.
of goes through the sort of Obama administration's role in fostering DEI policies. Not many people remember there actually was an Obama executive order for DEI in federal offices in 2011. And that came in the context of Obama getting more and more criticism from his left, from people like Cornel West, calling Obama an oligarch and a servant of Wall Street. So I think a lot of people already know this intuitively. Like there's a meme where like the banker uh, says that introduce the Occupy Wall Street people to identity politics, and they'll completely lose their political footing and be diverted. And this article sort of strives to bring the receipts where that really has a basis in truth that Obama turned more and more to identity politics and kind of social radicalism because he started out as a social moderate. He turned more and more to that when it was clear that he wasn't going to make economic reforms.
Yeah, that's just such a good point because the hypocrisy. I mean, even things like gay marriage and whatnot, like Obama and Hillary Clinton and all those people, they all shifted on it and this gaslighting, acting like they never had socially moderate views. And then as soon as it became opportune for them politically, they just abruptly changed their tune. And I'm looking forward to reading your article. Christian Perenni actually wrote a great article about some of the stuff that was going on in the George Floyd protests. I think he called about he traced it back to things in Herbert Marcuse. He wrote a great article. So I'd like to see your article as far as what you get into about Obama and that angle. So yeah, definitely send that to us when it's done. And I hope you continue
I
to
will.
submit stuff to CAM too. I know that they take a while to publish things. They have a very rigorous editing process. And I'm also sorry because I know it actually coincidentally, when Shayna came across your article, uh, she sent it to me. And then I really liked it. And when I went to email you, it was in my unfocused. So you'd actually tried to contact me. So I'm assuming you'd read my work on Sutton before. So it was great to finally
Yeah, yeah,
connect with you and do this. So yeah, this has
yeah.
been
Well, thank you for publishing it. However roundabout way it went. There are very few like kind of established left publications, um, probably that would accept a so-called anti-vaxxer populist, as a contributor.
well, I know that there's even infighting within the place itself, at least so I hear. But yeah, this was great, and yeah, we'll put this up and send it to you, and I'm sure we'd love to have you on again in the future um, about your writing and other stuff you do. I also just wanted to say that since we don't have a credit line or any credits at the beginning or end, that Shayna does all the video work and the imagery and everything here at Captive Mind. So uh, if you're impressed by the collages and the video and the imagery, it's not me, it's Shayna.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Max. And I want to say thank you, Garrett, for having you. It's been really great. And just one last, my final thought, I guess, is I want to read this Fred Hampton quote that you cited in your piece that you wrote. It says, when I talk about the masses, I'm talking about the white masses. I'm talking about the black masses and the brown masses and the yellow masses too. You got to face the fact that some people say you fight fire best with fire, but we say you put fire out best with water. We say you don't fight racism with racism. We're going to fight racism with solidarity. Close quote.
That's what it's all about.
Great way
Right.
to end.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Thank you.